The fall fiscal update charts a careful course to balance, but with some plans to spend windfall revenue. Here's a look by the numbers. First, the good news. The federal deficit is down to $36.4 billion from $52.8 last spring. That's thanks to a surge in tax revenues, courtesy of higher commodity prices and inflation. The feds are spending a big chunk of that windfall, though, with $13.4 billion in new spending this year and another $44 billion through to the spring of 2027. The path back to balance suggests that by 2028, the government could post a small surplus of $4.5 billion. But between now and then, a recession could upset some of these projections. The government is relying on growth averaging above 2% out to 2027, and that's well above the historic average. Included in this year's $6.1 billion of new spending, the temporary sales tax rebate and other supports for low-income Canadians announced earlier this fall. While the update may be applauded for its prudence, it doesn't offer much in new support for building the jobs or economy of the future. That's something that could come in next spring's budget, but can Canada afford to wait? Navdeep Bains is Vice Chair of Global Investment Banking at CIBC and a former Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry for this government. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me on, Amanda.
So let's start with, I state that you did once work for this Prime Minister, so you might have a bias here in terms of political affiliation. But when you look at this, I would say it's a careful budget. Is it enough of a creative budget, given where we have to go as an economy?
It's a mini budget, and I think the government's trying to find that balance of trying to demonstrate fiscal prudence and also lay track for long-term economic growth. And you saw some of that in the measures they proposed with regards to climate technology. And that's primarily in response to the Inflation Reduction Act that was introduced in the United States just a few months ago.
And on that front, I mean, there will be some stiff competition for attracting the talent, for the investments that will make some of those new technologies win. And as you've noted, not recently, some of them are still in very much the development phase. We don't know which of the technologies that will win. There's going to be investments we have to make. How much of a risk or gamble should we take in order to be at the front of one of those?
Well, if you're thinking about long-term economic growth, investing in climate technologies makes a lot of sense. And that's why it's great to see the government introduce this 30% tax incentive for nuclear energy, for hydrogen, for solar and wind. These are all important areas where we can attract investments into Canada and focus on creating high-quality green jobs. But it's going to be a very competitive landscape. And so we need to also have the right regulations in place. But fundamentally, this is where the growth opportunity is, because by 2050, in order to get to net zero, $150 trillion is going to be deployed in order, capital will be deployed in order to reach that target. So it's an incredible opportunity for economic growth, particularly coming out of this broad inflationary environment that we're currently in.
There's also a big push to up our numbers on immigration, Navdeep, up to 500,000 a year. We're already at a pretty high number, right, about 400,000. Are we spending enough and focusing enough on integration? Because getting a new Canadian into a house, into the right doctor, into schools, there's a big process here. Are we actually focusing on that side of the equation?
You're absolutely right. There's two components there. One is you got to bring the people in, and then you got to make sure that they're properly integrated so we can see them reach their full potential and to get the economic benefits associated with that. And that's fundamentally important right now because we're dealing with a tight labor market. Even with the inflationary environment that we're in, with high interest rates, we're still dealing with record low unemployment. So we need immigration for economic growth. We need immigration to deal with the 1 million vacancies that we have in Canada, but we have to build the infrastructure. That's housing, that's dealing with healthcare support, that's making sure that credentials are properly recognized. So this is where the federal government must work with the provincial government to better integrate those newcomers.
Navdeep, great to have you with us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Amanda.
Navdeep Bains, Vice Chair of Global Investment Banking at CIBC, a former Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry. Well, countries around the world are changing how they trade and think about trading and bringing supply chains and human capacity back home. For Canada, that could be a generational opportunity to create a new framework for growth by rebuilding our supply of things rather than relying on external sources. Ed Greenspon is co-author of a new paper on this subject and President and CEO of the Public Policy Forum. Ed, great to have you with us.
Great to be here, Amanda.
So the shift that you're talking about, and it's part of this whole kind of, I guess we would say, reverse globalization, right? The move away from the integration of economies to maybe a little disintegration. What does it mean to rebuild supply? What's a supply rebuild for Canada?
Well, it means we've been concentrating for the last 20 years in many ways on playing defense, and you can understand that. We had a great financial recession. We had to play defense there and pump demand into the economy. We had the pandemic, and again, we had to do the same thing. But now we're faced with extraordinary forces, both geopolitical change that's going on and as well as climate change and the energy transition. And if we don't build quickly and build in a 1950s style when we built the St. Lawrence Seaway and a Trans-Canada pipeline and a Trans-Canada highway and suburbs and campuses all at the same time, if we don't build a lot of new electricity, ICUs, which we discovered we had in rather short supply, all sorts of things and people that we we just haven't been doing the building. And so we're going to fall behind because now it's time to play offense.
It's a really strong vision, Ed, of what we could look to the future and how we could be in the world. Do we have the political capital? Are there people in governments at every level who could do this kind of thing? It feels like a bit of a different era than even 30 years ago when we were doing big trade agreements.
Yeah, I think we're starting to move in that direction. I think governments are moving in that direction in Canada and the United States. We're today responding a lot to the Inflation Reduction Act. That's that kind of vision, if you will. A lot of money on building the future and clearing away some of the things that prevent it. There's a lot of political pressure on this. Housing is a very good example. We haven't built enough housing. You were just talking with Navdeep Bains about immigration. Well, we're going to bring in more immigrants. We already have a housing crisis and price and shortage, despite what's happening with interest rates. And so, we're just going to have to free the way. So I think governments are seeing it. I think it's becoming an intellectual movement. If you're going to have policy, it has to be nestled into a big framework of ideas. And it was when Keynesian ideas were around. It was when the neoliberals and Friedmans were around. But now we haven't in this country even had a big discussion about what is that framework since Donald MacDonald's Royal Commission in the 1980s. So, yeah, it's time. And I think we know what the agenda's about.
All right, and not a ton of time here, but are you optimistic that this framework, because as you say, there's a kind of a building movement in this direction around the world, so Canada will be aware that it should play a role. Are you optimistic that we will do it?
So I'm optimistic we'll do it. I don't know if I'm optimistic that we'll do it in a timely manner in which gives us some competitive advantage. And I know I have very little time, but electrification, we have to double the amount of electricity we have. Mm-hmm. That's one more of everything that we have already. Can we give ourselves the political will to get that done and not to have everybody whose backyard doesn't want to have a transmission line near it or a wind farm, a good thing, having a blocking veto? That won't get it done.
Ed, so good to have you. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Amanda.
Ed Greenspon is President and CEO of the Public Policy Forum. Coming up, Ontario is once again using the notwithstanding clause to overrule our country's constitution. The implications of lawmakers tearing up the rule book. But first, this. If you don't get the iPhone you wanted for Christmas, blame China's zero COVID policy. It has the factory and surrounding area that produces the vast majority of iPhones on lockdown. Some workers are fleeing the plant rather than remain locked up. Bonuses are being offered to try to retain workers, but one source suggests production could slump 30%, making China's already unpopular policy the Grinch for the globe. We're back after this.